We never encouraged patients to transition. We said, if you want to pursue the idea of transitioning, this is what you have to do. We never said you should transition.
My feeling is that they were dictated to because they did everything that WPATH demanded. And if you look at the ICD, the World Health Organization's classifications, the trans activist group WPATH and another trans activist group, they came up with gender incongruence, and they came up with the idea to move this out of mental disorders, and they even came up with the idea to create a whole new section just for gender incongruence so that it could be a disorder of sexual health. You can see them doing it in their meetings and in their papers, and then these big organizations, the APA and the World Health Organization, just do exactly what they're told. You can see it.
You're not going to have decent research on gender identity disorders for another 10 or 20 years because it basically comes out of academia. Those are the people with the stat skills and the knowledge of how to do it, and it's a toxic topic. There are some heroic individuals like Mike Bailey and his students who do continue to do research in this area, but majority of universities, nobody's going to touch it because nobody wants a lot of trans activists voting their deans or whatever and trying to get them fired.
Welcome, Dr. Ray Blanchard, to the podcast.
It's happy to be here.
Now, it's hard for me to imagine that there are still some people out there who don't know who you are and don't know what autogynephilia is, but there are such innocents in the world. So could you begin by briefly introducing yourself and what is autogynephilia?
Okay, briefly introducing myself. My name is Ray Blanchard. I worked for 15 years in a gender identity clinic from 1980 to 1995, and then I switched my focus to a assessment clinic for the assessment of sex offenders. During the years when I was working in gender, I published a lot of papers to do with gender identity disorders, and I think that's what people, for example, online know me as now with regard to the gender identity disorder papers, although actually, from my perspective, I wrote them a lifetime ago. In those papers, I identified something I called autogynephilia. It would scoop in what used to be called transvestism, but I recognized that the label transvestism was misleading and far too narrow. So I defined autogynephilia as a male's propensity to be sexually aroused by the thought or image of himself as a female. And I also hypothesized, well, I think it's more than a hypothesis, I also stated that this was one of the two main pathways to transsexualism in male to female transsexuals.
Interesting. So that was 1989. Am I correct? You outlined autogynephilia?
That was the year in which I gave it the name autogynephilia. Yeah. I had been circling around the concept, but it was in 1989 that I finally found a word that I thought described it.
So prior to that time, my understanding is everyone knew there were two groups, and everyone knew one group of men were heterosexual, and everybody knew that there was some sort of erotic motivation. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, everyone knew that there were at least two groups. Some other authorities had posited 3 groups or 4 groups or 5 groups. I did a bunch of formal studies and concluded that really it boiled down to 2 basically different groups, with what other researchers had identified as separate groups just being subtypes.
And one group was homosexual, the other heterosexual. The homosexuals, I was reading Anne Lawrence's Men Trapped in Men's Bodies just recently, and in that book, she suggests that the homosexual transsexuals, there's no erotic motivation. It's strictly, just wanting to blend in or internalized homophobia. Do you agree with that?
I agree that it's not primarily erotically motivated. I think that these are individuals who feel like the opposite sex from early childhood. And whereas a lot of cross-gendered children normalize in gender identity around puberty, these individuals don't normalize in gender identity around puberty, and they carry forward that cross-gender feelings and aspirations into adulthood. But I don't think, as some people have alleged, that they transition in order to sleep with straight guys. I don't believe that. I mean, I think that's maybe a benefit or an aspiration, but I don't think that that's their primary motivation.
Could I ask? I've met a few gay men, detrans, also remaining trans, who say that they were autogynephilic or are, and they're also gay. What is your position on that? Like, people say a lot of things. People say more than their prayers, as my mother used to say. But I have been told specifically by individuals that they are autogynephilic and gay. What's your take on all that?
In the years that I was interviewing patients, which was 1980 to 1995, I interviewed one biological male patient that I thought was genuinely homosexual and genuinely autogynephilic. Just the one. And I interviewed the hell out of him because, I didn't like the idea of these two types overlapping. But as far as I could see, this one patient was really, really homosexual in the way other patients were homosexual, and was really autogynephilic in the way other patients were really autogynephilic. But that's one patient out of many that I interviewed. And so I tend to be suspicious of people who say, who are like online, and, oh no, I'm a snowflake and I don't fit into these categories, and I have some of this and I have some of that, and I'm an original. So I tend to be a little skeptical of that.
Could you explain how you came to the realization that, because I think was before it was mostly people just thought they would these men were transvestites. They were turned on by wearing women's clothes, and some just wanted to do that full time and get hormones and surgeries. Like, how did you come to separate transvestites from autogynephilia?
Prior to the time that I invented the word autogynephilia, clinicians were aware that the people they were calling transvestites were not simply cross-dressing and masturbating. Clinicians were well aware that there was a mental content that accompanied periods of cross-dressing and sexual excitement, and that this mental content involved thoughts of being like a female or aspirations of being like a female. But they never bothered to change the word transvestite. And when I say other clinicians were aware of the mental content, even Magnus Hirschfeld himself, the man who invented the word transvestite, commented in print that the word transvestite merely referred to the most observable symptom, but it did not capture the essence of what the experience was like. So when I was working in this area, I decided, why not bite the bullet and invent a new word that actually focuses people on the essence of this syndrome, which is the mental content of feeling like a female, perceiving oneself as a female, and just indicate that cross-dressing is a conspicuous, striking symptom of this, but is not the essence or the defining characteristic of the syndrome. That was how it came about.
And can you explain how you did it? You developed an ingenious test.
I had a lot of questionnaire materials that I had developed when I first started working at the clinic, and I asked all kinds of questions I just asked every question that I could think of. I didn't have the concept of autogynephilia in mind, so there was no way I could tailor those questionnaire materials to autogynephilia. Just luckily, in my obsessional listing of every question I could think of, there were some that I could put together as a kind of scale for autogynephilia. So that helped me. But in fact, I guess my main breakthrough came when I interviewed a patient who never cross-dressed at all, but just had sexual fantasies in which he pictured himself as a nude female. And he was also gender dysphoric. Not the most gender dysphoric I've ever seen, but gender dysphoric enough to be unhappy and present at a clinic. So seeing that patient where there's no cross-dressing made me realize, no, there really has to be another word for this. And that patient kind of tipped me over the edge where I thought, I've got to find a word. But it wasn't the questionnaires per se. I returned to the questionnaires once I had this, well, calling it insight sounds congratulatory, but once I had this thought that, no, I really have to invent another word, although I didn't really want to.
And did you measure arousal with penis gauges or pressure gauges or something?
Not in most of these patients. I published one paper in which I did phallometric testing of patients who denied that they were erotically aroused by cross-dressing and showed that there was, in fact, some detectable penile arousal. But that was just one study. It wasn't central to my concept of autogynephilia. It was addressed more, what are we to do with people who look like autogynephiles in every regard, but say that they have zero response to cross-gender ideation?
And how much resistance was there when you published your paper in 1989? Because people have extraordinary reactions to autogynephilia today. What was the response back then?
It was zip. Nobody read them.
That's my problem.
I think that those papers would have been totally, just more trivial academic papers that get zero citations ever, except that two people discovered them and promoted them for me. One was Ann Lawrence and one was Mike Bailey. Both of them read these papers and really liked them, and they started writing about them. But I had and have never had really any capacity for promoting my work or myself. So if people hadn't come along and promoted those papers for me, nobody would ever have heard of them.
Can we leap to 2015 now? Maybe we'll come back to Mike Bailey in a minute. Because my thing, I always think about, in 2015, the Jenner moment. Caitlyn Jenner is on the cover of Vanity Fair, Woman of the Year, I do believe, and the trans rights movement just launches, and it's enormous, and the messaging is everywhere. What was that like for you, given that well, I certainly assume that Jenner is an autogynephilic man, just as Laverne Cox, who was on Time magazine. What was that like for you, understanding autogynephilia and then seeing these men celebrated in such a way?
2015. Well, let me think.
Oh, did you notice it, first of all?
Well, of course. I mean, it was inescapable. The Caitlyn Jenner thing was everywhere in the media. So you would have to have been vacationing on Mars. I don't think I had much reaction to it. I mean, at this point, I had moved from gender identity to the gender identity clinic to to the clinic that assessed sex offenders in 1995 or 1996. And then I had retired in 2010. So, my gender days were already long in the rearview mirror before Caitlyn Jenner came out. So I just thought, well, I didn't have a strong emotional reaction to it.
So you didn't have a sense of foreboding that something bad is about to happen, celebrating autogynephilia in this way?
I don't think the people who were celebrating her knew they were celebrating autogynephilia.
That's the
In fact,
point.
I'm quite sure they didn't.
That's my whole point.
And for the record, I'm not saying that Caitlyn Jenner is an autogynephile. I would never diagnose anybody with any condition, over the media. Just to be clear on that. I don't know what to say about it. I had no particular reaction to it. I wasn't politically oriented at that point, or really very much now either. And I think the Caitlyn Jenner episode was still well before the point at which the activists completely reframed transsexualism as a political problem rather than a clinical problem. That was when I really kind of pricked up my ears and realized, oh, things have totally changed. The activists are now saying transsexualism is a political problem. It's a matter of political oppression. It's not a clinical disorder. That was when I thought, oh, wait a minute, things have really changed.
So then WPATH, because WPATH, their de-psychopathologization campaign started in 2010, and that's when they made trans natural and healthy, not a paraphilia, not a mental disorder, natural and healthy, and it's a human right to access hormones and surgeries. Are you saying that that all just totally passed you by because you'd retired?
Well, I hadn't retired from doing human sex research, but I wasn't actively involved in researching gender identity disorders. So things that I had very publicly resigned from WPATH many years prior. So, anything they did to me was like, well, that's what they're up to now.
For those who don't know, could you let people know? I presume you saw the kind of the horror show. Well, I've no doubt you watched it in close proximity to what happened to Mike Bailey. He effectively brought out autogynephilia from your kind of academic research in 1989 to the masses, well, in a smaller mind, but to the public, with The Man Who Would Be Queen. And I presume that was an unnerving experience. Could you just tell just our listeners who don't know about that, just what happened there?
Well, a professor at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, as I mentioned earlier, had discovered my writings, which up to that point were quite obscure, and promoted them in a book that he wrote. It meant to be a popular book, a trade book on cross-gender identity, anatomically normal people. And part of it was about the homosexual type of gender dysphoria. A large part of it was about the autogynephilic type of gender dysphoria. This enraged some high-profile trans activists. I won't, since they're public figures, I won't say what diagnostic category they're in. But so they started a campaign to try and get him fired from his job, and they really did make his life very unpleasant. So as to my reaction at that time, I was horrified that somebody should have gotten into such difficulties because they liked stuff I had written enough to try and write about it themselves and promote the idea. I felt guilty. I kind of had survivor's guilt, although I hadn't actually done anything bad, but I just felt so terrible. This man, because he liked my work, is having people doing everything in their power to get him fired from his job. It really was, a very nasty episode. Not to mention how it was for Mike Bailey.
Yeah.
But
they
for
called
me,
him a rapist, or they said he was a sex abuser. They really threw everything at him.
Everything they could think of. They went bonkers. I think they were probably these were very successful individuals in their professional lives, and they were also living as females in their professional lives, and I think they felt that they were on the brink of total victory, and here somebody comes along and potentially screws everything up. So naturally they went into a rage.
And that's very much a microcosm for trans activism. It's the same, what happened to Mike Bailey is what happened to wider society when trans activism launched. Trans rights had to viciously destroy anyone who mentioned autogynephilia, because you cannot build a rights movement on autogynephilia. You can't build it on a paraphilia. It's not going to be an easy sell. Do you see the way, I see modern trans activism as being largely an autogynephile rights movement, and then the contagion just spiraled out and sucked in a whole bunch of innocent kids muddling through puberty? Do you think that's an accurate description?
It's really hard for me to sort those two things out. I mean, the autogynephilic input into trans activism has been documented by other people who've tracked down this group of high-profile autogynephiles who met in some place in Indonesia called Yogyakarta, and they had the money from somewhere. Well, some of these people were billionaires, but so they hired some famous law firm called Denton's, which gave them political advice to keep this discussion out of the public forum and work behind the scenes with politicians, which I think was, from their standpoint of view, very prudent, because public discussion of it was not the way to go. So that was one phenomenon. How that tied into the rapid onset gender dysphoria cohort is something that I don't know, or how it tied into the rapid onset gender dysphoria cohort. I've often thought it was strange that the trans activists who were primarily autogynephiles should concern themselves with children. I think it was politically a bad move. I mean, if there was anybody who was going to get their back up, it was going to be parents of kids who said, I think I want my breasts removed. They're really bugging me and I feel like a man. So I think they antagonized the group that was going to be not only most motivated to fight back, but the group who was going to be most sympathetic to the general public. And I don't know why they did that. Maybe they thought they had to circle the wagons and that nothing about cross-gender living could be questioned, that it needed to be a unified front all the way around. They could have said, yeah, well, you know what? We transitioned when we were adults, having tried everything else and been unsuccessful. And to save our lives from lives of total misery, we transitioned as grown adults who understood the consequences. This has nothing to do with 14-year-old girls. I think they could have gone that route. Why they didn't, I have no idea.
May I give you my theory and you can tell me whether you think it's plausible?
Okay.
My theory is all about hiding autogynephilia. It's that they built their rights movement. They had to come up with a reason, a cause for being trans that was not paraphilia, sexual deviancy, anything like that. So they come up with gender identity, and then they come up with trans is natural and healthy and it's innate, and you just have this mismatched gender identity. But if it's innate, then you have to have trans children. And the very fact that you have trans children means that further reinforces the fact that it's not a sexual deviancy and it's not a paraphilia. So it's the very act of trying to hide autogynephilia that meant we had to have this trans children gender identity movement.
I think that's a good hypothesis. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that could have started the rapid onset gender dysphoria phenomenon, but it would certainly have been a good rationale for latching onto it once it was underway.
I have more to say. I didn't get there.
Okay.
So that's the trigger, though. You see, so you've got to push the idea onto society that what makes you a man, a woman, a boy, or a girl is a gender identity. This is a mad idea and it's completely new, and you have to force it on all of society. So you do that through a huge media campaign. We've seen you put it in schools. You teach children as young as kindergarten. You read them the book I Am Jazz. So you push this messaging really aggressively because you're desperate to hide autogynephilia, and then you trigger a social contagion because the idea itself is so contagious. If you hate your body, that could be a sign you're trans. That's the messaging that they pushed, and that's every kid going through puberty.
Again, I think it's plausible. I think you need a historian of science or a historian of social movements to look at the data in detail and say, this year this happened, this year this happened, this year this happened. I mean, professional historians have ways of approaching things so that they minimize the chance that they're cherry picking data to fit their theories. I'm not a professional historian. I don't even know how a professional historian works, but I know there are such people. So, for me, the connections between those two things, your ideas are as good as any, maybe better than most, but I don't know the chronology well enough to say, yeah, that fits exactly what happened in this year, and then this year, and then this year.
In fairness,
plausible is good enough
I
for
want to
me.
be old, ifs, ands, or buts academics. I have to.
In fairness, Mia is phenomenally well researched in that field. Just for my own tuppence worth, insofar as if you look at things through the mental illness lens, I know that, like, if you meet, let's say, a group of alcoholics, they want to meet other alcoholics who also drink. They're very actively invested in the idea of, we all have to drink. Sure, life would kill you if you didn't. And so I can see how, just if somebody was mentally ill, for example, and if they had autogynephilia, they'd be thrilled to come across a kid who said that they were really trapped in the wrong body. They'd say, "Yes, just like me. Yes, it's so normative. It's loads of us." I can just see how that could really gain wings with people. But I want to go in another direction, if I could. WPATH, you said you'd left them years before, Ray. Could you tell us? Myself and Mia have been all over WPATH, well, for some time now. So could you tell us your experiences?
I had belonged to WPATH. I had been to a couple of their conferences. At the point when I was attending, it was still mostly run by clinicians, professional clinicians. There were a small number of transsexuals attending, but they were not in the majority. I resigned during the Mike Bailey controversy, which we've already talked about. The accusations against him by the trans activists triggered various, I guess, professional bodies or whatever to look into Mike, all of which exonerated him of anything. But during this period when he was being looked at by various bodies, somehow WPATH chose to involve themselves in it. They wrote some letter or something. This enraged me, totally enraged me, because the matter was under investigation. They were in no position to know all the facts of the matter, but they were choosing to involve themselves in an investigation of an academic without having any knowledge of the circumstances. And I was just enraged, as I said, and I thought, oh no, 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 no. And so I resigned. I forget how I managed to make sure that my resignation letter would become public, but I did somehow, one way or another. And then finally, oh yeah, some trans activist put it on her webpage, which still exists as a zombie webpage, although she's dead. So whenever I need to see what's in that letter, I just go to this person's webpage, and she saved it for me, whereas I had, kept no record of it.
I can't believe I haven't read it. I'm going to read it right after this interview. I can't believe I didn't know about this.
Well, it's just what you would expect. First, I give my credentials. I've always been strongly in favor of clinical attention for blah, blah, blah. You have to always give your credentials first. Nevertheless, and then it was about how angry I was that they had chosen to involve themselves in an investigation of a person that they had no knowledge about the circumstances.
Sounds very WPATH to me, modern day WPATH anyway. I want to go back to, we did just cover somewhat how to treat autogynephilia, and I know it's outside your area of expertise, but my question from the cultural political slant is, this rights movement was something, it's like a kamikaze mission or something. They just basically torpedoed societal acceptance as thoroughly and completely as possible with the approach that they took to this rights movement. And so I've always understood that you lean towards medicalization as being a good option for some autogynephilic men, but now that societal acceptance is so low and is going to continue to plummet, do you still think that it's a good idea for these men to take this medical path?
That's a very good question. And in fact, I was thinking about that issue when I was, taking 20 minutes before starting this interview to think what I would say. And you've asked me exactly one of the questions that I thought I might be asked. In the time frame in which I was in the business, the number of patients who were transitioning was microscopic compared to what it was now. I worked in a clinic that was the only clinic empowered by the province of Ontario to approve reimbursement for sex reassignment. And we also did this for other Canadian provinces, 5 or 6 of the others who didn't have their own gender identity clinics. So out of most of Canada, we were approving for surgery maybe 10 patients per year. 10 patients per year. And we assessed one new patient per week, basically. Um, so it was a very small number of patients we approved. Furthermore, we were gatekeeping on steroids. I mean, our patients had to live as the opposite sex for 2 years before we considered them eligible for sex reassignment procedures. And during these 2 years, they had to either work or attend school in the opposite sex role, and they had to come and provide us with documentation that proved they were doing this. So so it was the number of patients that we approved that I shouldn't say encouraged, because we never encouraged patients to transition. We said, if you want to pursue the idea of transitioning, this is what you have to do. We never said you should transition. So that was the context in which I developed my attitude, which I still hold, that for some highly selected group of patients for whom nothing else has worked and who are mature enough and old enough to understand what they're doing, yes, for some of these patients, transition does give them a better overall quality of life. And I haven't backed down from that, and I never will back down from that, because that's the evidence of my own senses. Now, if I were talking to a patient now, I might have to say, look, if this were 30 or 40 years ago, I might say, go for it, but you have to understand that now this has become such an issue in society that it might or might not maximize your overall quality of life to transition. And this might seem unfair, but life is unfair.
I saw a quote of yours where you said, it was quite interesting, it's irrelevant whether a man can become a woman or vice versa. What's relevant is whether individuals tormented by the desire to be the opposite sex are happier when they present that way, and whether or how much the majority of society is willing to accommodate this. And it's this that, Mia has highlighted. Now that society is looking like it's less and less likely or able to accommodate it, everything has changed. As well as that, I think arguably our understanding of autogynephilia, now that it's in much bigger numbers, it can be studied perhaps more extensively and more in depth. And perhaps there's other, and this is where I want you to answer on, Ray, there's other aspects of being autogynephile that might have been unstudied previously. Like, for example, what are the links with maybe sadism or masochism or narcissism? As well as that, what are the links with autistic thinking? And as well as that, there's a few other things. But first of all, I wanted to ask about that.
I'm not sure. I'm trying to distill a question out of that.
I can see why you had trouble. What I wanted you to ask is, society is less willing to accommodate, arguably. It certainly seems to be increasingly less willing. As well as that, there seems to be some traits that are quite antisocial with autogynephiles. Are you not convinced?
Some traits that are antisocial. Because I worked in a clinic that saw every kind of patient, I think I have a kind of cross-sectional experience that very few people would have now. The clinic I saw was approving payment for people who wanted sex reassignment. So we saw all kinds of people. You could, of course, if you wanted to, pay privately for surgery, but even rich people like free stuff. So I saw a wide cross-section of people, and a lot of the things that I see online, people saying, oh, they're all pedophiles, they're all this, they're all that. No.
I thought the likelihood of having one paraphilia makes it more likely. I'm not saying pedophilia, but it makes it more likely you'll have another paraphilia.
Yes, but I think, yes, that's true. But I think you have to, it clusters if you have a given paraphilia, it makes certain other paraphilias more likely, but it doesn't make every kind of paraphilia more likely. I think autogynephilia for sure makes masochism more likely. I do not think it makes pedophilia more likely. Now, remember, I was 15 years in a clinic for gender patients and 15 years in a clinic for sex offenders. So I think if there was some substantial overlap of pedophilia, yeah, I would know. And I can recall maybe 3 or 4 patients who were autogynephilic and also, I think coincidentally, were pedophilic.
What about, you said masochism, what about sadism?
Probably, yeah. I mean, there have been some serial killers who cross dressed. Yeah, there've been a handful of them. Sure.
And what about exhibitionism and voyeurism? Was there an overlap there?
They have a certain kind of peculiar exhibitionism, which is not flashing the penis, which would be kind of self-defeating, but they might contrive to show somehow that they have panties on underneath, or they might expose their buttocks to a strange woman if they think they have particularly feminine buttocks. But that's, as I said, it's a peculiar kind of exhibitionism. It's not flashing open your raincoat and showing your penis to, a strange female on the subway.
And what about transvestism then and exhibitionism? Is there an overlap there? Because I'm just thinking we opened up women's spaces to these men. Any man can walk in and say, I'm a woman. And that just, to me, opens up our spaces to exhibitionists. But is there an overlap between cross-dressing and exhibitionism?
Well, I think you could make an argument that cross-dressing is a form of exhibitionism. But as I've just indicated, I don't think there's an overlap between cross-dressing and flashing your penis kind of exhibitionism.
That's the type I'm talking about, because that's what they're doing in all these changing rooms. It's just open exhibitionism.
That could be. That was not happening in my day because it just wasn't happening in my day. In my day, the patient's ideal was to pass so well that they were undetectable.
Okay, that brings me perfectly to what I want to ask next. I meant to look. I read a tweet of yours that made me laugh a year or 2 ago. I can't remember. I meant to refresh my memory before this, but then I didn't have time. And somebody had made a compilation video of a bunch of autogynephilic men and the things that they had posted online. And you wrote a tweet saying you just couldn't believe the kind of content that these men were publicly sharing on the internet these days. And my question is there some sort of self-delusion that they don't see what we see? With autogynephilia, is there some kind of something happens that they cannot see what we can see in these videos?
Absolutely. I think that it's very, very common for autogynephiles to get dressed and look in a mirror and think, "Ooh, not bad," and whereas anybody else would think, it's a guy in a dress and a wig. I mean, I don't mean to say that to ridicule them. I would not want to be an autogynephile. I really wouldn't. But it's true that, their perception of how good they look as females is very much distorted by their desire to look like attractive females. And I don't think this is a unique pathology. I think many people in many different situations have their perceptions distorted by what they want to see. So I think it's just part of a larger human propensity.
As well as that, there's anorexia, anorexics who think that they're fat and, body dysmorphics. Like that would be quite common, that they genuinely think that they have fat thighs or something like that. And they're a bag of bones when they're looking in the mirror.
Yeah. This is the opposite, though. They're seeing something.
Yeah. They're seeing that would be as if anorexics were fat and looked in the mirror and said, "Wow, am I ever skinny?"
But it's stemming from the same point in my world, insofar as it's their fixation. If you follow me, their fixation is.
I do follow you. There is I think for those of us who are not autogynephilic, it seems as if there is an obsessional flavor to it. Yeah.
That's why I've thought a lot about autism and autistic traits around autogynephilia. And people spoke so much about ROGD and autistic traits, and I agree. But then since I've met a very large number of people who've transitioned, and I have, I've really seen a very, very notable prominence in autistic thinking. And I think it wasn't massively highlighted back in the old research. And I think it's an issue.
That's quite possible. One of the points I should make about my own clinical experience was that the clinic where I worked was a tertiary referral center. Typically, a patient went first to their general practitioner. The general practitioner referred them to a psychiatrist in general practice, and the psychiatrist referred them on to my clinic. So a lot of patients probably, I shouldn't say a lot because I have no way of knowing, but I'm going to say that patients with other kinds of readily diagnosable mental disorders might have been screened out before they ever got as far as my clinic.
Could I ask, because I think it's also got neglected in the research, and I'd like to know your views. And I can see why when somebody comes to me and they might have alcoholism, I'm focusing on the individual, the same with anorexia. The trans widows feel like they were written out of history. They feel like they were ignored when the clinical assessments and evaluations were happening. And in a way, they were almost bit players, if you follow me, in the clinical assessment, when their lives were arguably devastated by the autogynephiles, medical transition. What's your view of the entire trans widow issue? Because it's huge.
Well, I was always sympathetic to them. And in fact, I was asked to do one of these, online interviews by some organization for trans widows. And I did the interview. And during that interview, I expressed my sympathy for their position. I might say parenthetically, their position seems to me not entirely different from the position of women whose husbands come out as gay and decide to end the marriage. But maybe the wives of the autogynephiles are slightly more traumatized because their husbands try to engage them in their paraphilia, whereas wives of gay men do not try to engage them in their sexual activity. Anyway, yeah, so I've always been sympathetic to them. Now, I have been online, of course, accused by trans widows of ignoring trans widows and not having done anything to help them. The fact of the matter is that when I was seeing patients would usually present at the point at which their marriage was breaking up or had just broken up or was going to break up shortly. And the wives really didn't have that much motivation to ask to be seen at our clinic because the situation was resolving itself in the real world. So we did not very often see wives of gender dysphoric men, not because we wouldn't have seen them. I can recall one or two wives. I can certainly recall one where we did see a wife, but mostly the patients, their wives didn't ask to be seen by us because their situation was resolving on its own with a marital breakup. And what reason would they have to come to us?
I always think it just would be so much better if autogynephilic men did not get married. It's so catastrophic. You just blow up the lives of your whole family, your wife. Like, imagine children, your father transitions as an autogynephile. So destructive.
I agree with you 100%. And as a clinician, I would have no problem in saying to a autogynephilic patient who was starting to get gender dysphoric, I would have no problem cautioning them against getting married. That being said, I was a very atypical clinician. Most clinicians would rather have their fingernails pulled out than actually tell a patient what to do, even when the patient is clearly asking to be told what to do.
Do you think autogynephiles are more likely to remain transitioned or more likely to detransition because of disappointment with the medical treatment?
The autogynephiles I remember who detransitioned, and it wasn't a lot of them because, as I've already indicated, we had such a stringent procedure for approving them that it really minimized the chances of detransitioning. But the autogynephiles I remember who detransitioned, I think it was always the same cause. They got involved with a woman, either a new woman or they got re-involved with a former wife, and that was the reason that they decided to go back to the male role. It was a chercher la femme.
Sounds like an unstable detransition, though. Sounds unstable. I remember reading in Men Trapped in Men's Bodies about the cycle that autogynephilic men can get trapped in, where it's an erotic urge that propels them to want to be women, and then they take estrogen and hormone blockers, and that removes their sex drive and then removes their desire to be a woman. So then they detransition and they go off the drugs, and then the erotic, the sex drive comes back and the urge comes back, and they get trapped in this cycle. Did you see that?
Yeah, but I saw it. I remember one patient very distinctly, very intelligent, very articulate, very honest guy. And he had gone through exactly this kind of cycle. He'd get extremely gender dysphoric. He'd start to make moves in that direction. Then he'd go back to backing up and being in the male role. But I can't say that I saw it a lot. You know, uh, I only bring this up about the detransitioners because it struck me that there was this uniformity of why they detransitioned, and did they ever then break up with their wives a second time and retransition? Not to my knowledge, but
Was narcissism a common feature?
I think it depends on how you define narcissism. I think personality theorists who work in narcissism have a definition of narcissism that might not be met by autogynephiles who are just autogynephilic and nothing else. Now, you could say autogynephilia is by definition narcissism, because if you're looking at yourself and thinking, whoa, I'm so hot, I have to masturbate now. But I don't know that that's what people have in mind when they talk about narcissism in other kinds of individuals.
I don't know if you have any other questions, Mia. I'm down to ask Ray about the DSM and Alan Francis and hepaphilia, and remember the Ken.
Okay, well then I
Um,
have one more on
Go
autogynephilia,
ahead.
and then we'll go to Alan
We'll line you
Francis.
up.
My last one is, I feel like we can't have this conversation unless we talk about porn. And so I'd like to, one question is there any, is porn a major factor or a minimal factor in this? And then related to that is, a couple of years ago I read this very interesting Substack article, and it was a young detransition man who claimed that he had suffered from rapid onset autogynephilia, and it was from watching porn, trans type porn, sissy porn, I don't know, while he was a teenager, while he was developing. So is porn a factor, and do you think there's any validity to this idea that we could have rapid onset autogynephilia?
Okay, that's a couple of different questions. I'm going to start by saying that long before I started seeing patients in 1980, there were autogynephiles. There was no internet, let alone internet porn. And once, when I wanted, for because of research I was doing, I went on a mission to find female pornographic magazines, and I was all over Toronto, and I had a hell of a time finding any. So there were plenty of autogynephiles back in the day when it was not easy to even find print magazine porn of she-males, and there was no such thing as she-male video porn, or if there was, you certainly couldn't get it in the comfort of your home online. So I do not think that pornography historically has been a cause of autogynephilia. I think it mostly develops somehow during childhood and in isolation from any other people. Okay? That's number one. Number two, with regard to rapid onset produced by porn, how do you know if it's rapid onset or rapid realization? How do you know if this is a desire being implanted or being revealed?
The argument that he was making, if I remember correctly, was he was defining rapid onset autogynephilia as not being real. Like rapid onset gender dysphoria is some kind of subtype that it just basically looks like it's a bunch of confused kids that got thrown off course by the messaging of trans activism. And he was suggesting rapid onset autogynephilia was this pseudo autogynephilia that he had experienced because of his porn exposure, and he snapped out of it because autogynephilia seems to be forever. Like, you don't just get over your autogynephilia, do you?
It's hard for me to comment on individual cases.
Oh, just as a theory, does it sound plausible?
I'm trying to think of, I've seen patients who were clinically obsessional, who developed an obsessional notion that they were, for example, homosexual, who weren't homosexual at all. So yeah, you can. I remember one patient. How did it start? He was out in public doing something, and some man near him like bent over to pick up an object off the floor. And by seeing this man bend over, he got this obsessional idea that I might be homosexual. He wasn't homosexual, but he became obsessionally preoccupied with this. So yeah, ideas that are not truly reflective of an underlying erotic preference can be entertained and become obsessions for a time. Nothing is 100% or 0% in human sexology. So, what you're saying is possible. I don't know. But going back to my earlier point about is something implanted or revealed, I remember one patient who, as a child, was watching a cartoon with a character called Elmer Fudd. You're probably too young to remember.
I remember
Elmer Fudd.
Yeah.
But there was a cartoon in which Elmer Fudd, who was like an anthropomorphic pig, cross-dresses as a woman. And the patient said, it was like somebody hit me in the head with a brick.
Wow.
And that's why I'm saying, erotic preferences can be revealed suddenly.
There's more than one way to read that, but that's very, very interesting. So many people who medically transition can pinpoint, I went downstairs and I watched a film and bang, or there was an interview, or I opened a newspaper, my dad was reading a newspaper and I saw a picture and bang, there's something that happens there. And is it being revealed, or is something just been awakened? Well, we could go on forever about that. But I do, before we finish, I'm very anxious to talk about the DSM, if you don't mind. I know you were in the sorry, we're really putting you through the ringer here. We're getting our money's worth, and we're not even paying you. I'm very crass. But the DSM, the working group, you were on the DSM working group, if I'm right, DSM-4 and DSM-5 for gender dysphoria and sexual identity disorders. And we spoke with Alan Francis, which was very interesting. He didn't agree with us around gender issues. Then we spoke with Ken Zucker, who spoke to us about the DSM, working group. And he had a pretty horrifying story to talk about how the concept of hebephilia was taken out of the sexual disorder. So there's pedophilia, which is a paraphilia towards children, and hebephilia, if I'm right, is towards young teenagers. And that got removed in a very arbitrary way. Were you involved in that?
At the very last minute.
Yes, I was very much involved in all of that. I wrote a whole paper about it, actually. Once I had simmered down enough to be able to write a paper about it.
This was 5 years or something. Tell us the whole story. It was extraordinary.
Well, I can't tell you the whole story because essentially to be on the DSM-5, you had to sign like a non-disclosure agreement that you were not, I'm sure you know, but what had happened was I had made the existing and still existing definition of pedophilia in the DSM is that it's an erotic attraction or erotic preference for prepubertal children. And it gives a kind of guideline for what a prepubertal child is as 13 or younger. Well, that might have been okay for like 50, 60, 100 years ago, but 13 as a guideline for what's a prepubertal child is absurd now. So what I pointed out was, look, you're diagnosing people as pedophilic who don't meet your guidelines for pedophilia. My suggestion was change the definition of pedophilia so that it refers in some realistic way to prepubertal children, and add a diagnosis of hebephilia, which I didn't invent on the spot. People had talked about it before. Add a diagnosis of hebephilia for people who are most attracted to children in the early stages of puberty. That way, you would not be diagnosing any more cases overall. I think you'd be diagnosing the same number of cases overall, but you'd be diagnosing them more accurately so that you could differentiate between those who are attracted to prepubertal children and those who are attracted to pubertal children. And I should point out that by early puberty, I mean what are called Tanner stages. You can look it up. Tanner stages are very specific definitions. Children in Tanner stages 2 and 3 look very much like children. They have breast buds or tiny little breasts. They're not hot 17-year-old cheerleaders, okay? They still look like kids. This was elicited a great deal of resistance from certain factions within the American Psychiatric Association for various kinds of political reasons and what we might call guild reasons among forensic psychiatrists. And so the proposal was shot down like at the last minute, maybe not the last minute, but certainly the last day in a closed meeting, a closed secret meeting. And they elected to stay with the diagnostic criteria the way they were. And that's how they are to this day. And what had really angered me to the point that I finally wrote an article about it was that there was a section of the DSM intended to be for, what was it called, conditions requiring further study. So they could have made the decision to say, well, look, there's not enough evidence yet to regard hebephilia as a distinct paraphilia, so we're not going to make it a diagnosis, but we're going to put it in the section for conditions requiring further study. No, they didn't do that either. They just wanted the whole idea killed, and that's how they went.
And, to remind our listeners and viewers, the DSM seems to work by almost eminent experts in the field get together and effectively vote it in. So if everybody voted there was a God, you could stick in there is an existence of God. Like it seems to be really consensus by vote almost. Am I right in how these conditions get in?
Yeah, I mean, basically, they put together a committee of experts, more or less by reputation, and the people who accept the invitations, which probably most people do because it looks prestigious, accept the invitation to be on a working group for revising the DSM. But it's not, I mean, there isn't some kind of objective test. There's no entrance exam. There's no qualifying heats.
It feels like it's very conditional on the thinking of the time. That's why I brought up God, because in a certain kind of society, not believing in God could be considered pathological if you got this right group together, if you follow me. And the same about so many of these diagnoses are increasingly subject to the thoughts of the day. It feels too unscientific for me.
Well, that's probably true, but when was it ever different? I mean, the DSM obviously does not arrive by divine inspiration. You have to get people together to write it, and that's what they do. I mean, that's how it is now. It's probably how it always was. Well, maybe not the first DSM was probably even worse, but that's how it's been for a long time. You assemble a committee of people who, by their reputation or by their publication records, are considered experts in their field. You put together enough of them to have what you consider a sufficient number of people, and then they take it from there.
And how much political pressure is there? Because I tracked gender transsexualism to gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, gender incongruence, and obviously with a focus on WPATH and trans activists. And you can see the pressure. You can see them like WPATH concocting gender dysphoria specifically so that they can make trans natural and healthy, and a de-psychopathologization campaign. And they're writing these, they form the work group and then they're submitting their papers to the APA to get gender dysphoria, and then lo and behold, we get gender dysphoria. So in my mind, there's an awful lot of political shaping. Is that true?
Well, first place, I think it probably depends on what disorders we're talking about, but you're interested in gender identity disorders, so we'll stick to that. I was the chairperson of the sub work group for paraphilias, and I personally resisted pressure pretty much from outside. In one instance, I kind of gave into it, which I regret now, but I basically resisted external pressure. I remember there was one trans activist who was wanting to know when I was going to meet with her, and the answer was, well, I'm not. I think because the diagnosis of transvestism, which still exists in the DSM, was under my purview, so I think they thought I should meet with them, and I had no intentions of doing that. But with the sub work group for gender identity disorders was probably more friendly to getting feedback from the community. Now, were they actually dictated to by the community? I think that probably would be exaggerating the situation somewhat, but they certainly were a collection of clinicians who were, let us call it, sensitive to the feelings of the transgender community.
My feeling is that they were dictated to because they did everything that WPATH demanded. And if you look at the ICD, the World Health Organization's classifications, a trans activist group, WPATH, and another trans activist group, they came up with gender incongruence. And they came up with the idea to move this out of mental disorders. And they even came up with the idea to create a whole new section just for gender incongruence so that it could be a disorder of sexual health. You can see them doing it in their meetings and in their papers. And then these big organizations, the APA and the World Health Organization, just do exactly what they're told. You can see it.
Oh, that it's tempting to paint the situation as that bad, and I can understand the temptation. And I know all of the people who were on the gender identity disorders sub work group. I did not attend any of their meetings. I'm sure they would not have wanted me to attend their meeting. I didn't want to attend their meetings because I knew pretty much what they were up to, and I knew would not have been a happy experience. On the other hand, they had their own egos and their own agendas, and they might have corresponded to some extent with what WPATH wanted. I don't think it was as simple as them taking their marching orders from WPATH. I can understand why people might want to see it that way, but these people had their own egos, as I've said. And also they produced documents along the way that were published that explained what the rationale was for this or that. Now, with regard to the name change from transsexualism to gender dysphoria.
Or gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria.
Yeah, to gender. That was probably the main thing they did that I didn't really object to. And there was a reason for that, which was there are degrees of gender dysphoria that are very uncomfortable to patients, that affect their quality of life, but they're either intermittent and fluctuating or not severe enough to want to call them transsexualism. So I thought, I have no problem with changing the name of the diagnostic entity to gender dysphoria, because now you have a diagnosis and a reason to reimburse, let's say, clinical psychotherapy for patients who really are gender dysphoric enough to be unhappy, but you wouldn't want to diagnose them as transsexual. So that was the one thing that committee did I didn't object to for that reason.
And that's the thing that I object to the most.
Yeah.
Well, because you're coming at it from a political point of view, and I understand that, and I'm not coming at it from a political point of view.
We could
Not
have both,
necessarily a political point of view, though. For me, it's because when they changed it, and this is WPATH didn't even hide it. This was their goal. The idea was to change it from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, so that you shift the pathology to the distress that you feel, not the being trans, not the identity. That's perfectly natural and healthy. And you're shifting the diagnosis to the distress. And from that point on, the only thing you can do to manage that distress is hormones and surgeries, because you can't help them reconcile body and mind, because that's not a pathology, that's healthy.
This is not unique to gender identity disorders. The paraphilias, the diagnostic criteria for the paraphilias, which were changed to paraphilic disorders, it always had a distress criterion. Well, I shouldn't say always, because I don't recall DSM-1, but a distress criterion, either subjective distress or harming other people, has been part of the diagnostic criteria for paraphilias for a long time. So adding a distress criterion for gender identity disorders is not something new, and it's not something unique to that diagnostic category.
It's not a criterion, though. It's the entire diagnosis. The distress is the diagnosis, and it's deliberately done to shift the diagnosis from the identity. Because if the pathology is the identity, then you should treat the identity and try and reconcile body and mind, overcome the cross-sex identity. They shifted it deliberately to the distress, meaning the identity is healthy and the distress is what you treat with hormones and surgeries. That was what they did it for.
Well, I don't know how you would know what they did it for unless you asked those 4 people specifically, why did you do this? Just because some other organization who did not have members, here I'm defending a committee with which I basically am unsympathetic. Okay, so but I have to step in and
Devil's
say,
advocate,
look,
yeah.
To know why they did it, you would have to have an honest conversation with them. Not that that would ever occur, but you can't, because there are documents and people on some group out here claiming this is what we want. That does not necessarily mean that that's why the people on the committee did it. Things
so it's just
look like they're coordinated that are not actually coordinated, or that are coordinated for a different reason than you think.
So it's just a complete coincidence that WPATH do this and demand this, and then they did that, but for totally different reasons. But they did what WPATH said.
I wouldn't say it's a complete coincidence, because you have changes in the zeitgeist, which are going to affect what WPATH is saying, and which are also going to have affected what the Gender Identity Disorders Subcommittee was doing. So I wouldn't say they're completely unconnected, but I would say the connection might be more that they were operating in a common zeitgeist, rather than you have WPATH writing down, this is what we want in terms of diagnostic labeling, passed to this subcommittee and have them simply copy it. I don't think that happened.
Okay. It just looks like it. It looks like it to me.
I don't deny that it looks like it. I'm just saying.
I'm very suspicious, at the least, at the very least.
I remember a quote from you, Ray, where you said that was done for political reasons, and I hopped on it at the time.
Well, I would have to know exactly what that means. That was done for political reasons.
Yeah, it was. I'll tell you the context of it. It was the move from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, and it was to kind of basically pacify the more activist cohort. And it wasn't that you were against it as such, but it was primarily a political reason. I can look it up now if you like.
We interviewed Ken, who was on the committee, Ken Zucker.
Yeah.
And he didn't deny it. He just said he didn't see anything. He didn't see that it was a big deal. Sure, we did gender dysphoria, change of name, just didn't really see that it was a big deal.
Well, because Ken is looking at it as a clinician.
Yeah.
And you're looking at it as an activist. And not that there's anything wrong with it, but it's just a different perspective. From Ken's point of view, the same people are getting diagnosed. So what's the deal?
Yeah,
I'm
you
looking
see,
at
I'm
it.
looking at it from 2020.
Yeah.
I'm looking at it from a clinician's point of view, and I think we lost an awful lot. If we had gender dysphoria and gender identity disorder, we would have something we could work with. Because some people might have a deluded identity, and you could work with that, and some people might have distress over their gender issues, and I think that would be a really, actually, a workable diagnosis. You could have one and you could have the other. You could have both, but having one or the other, we've really missed, I think, a lot.
And in my defense, I'm looking at it from 2025, where we've had this explosion,
I'm
and
not
I'm trying
attacking. I don't want to attack you. So you don't need to say in my
I go
defense.
on.
in my no, but from 2025 we had this explosion. We had a massive psychiatric epidemic, and from 2025, my vantage point, I'm trying to make sense of how that happened. And one of the ways that happened is trans is natural and healthy. So we're going to put these people on the cover of magazines. We're going to celebrate them. We're going to promote this identity that is perfectly natural and healthy. And that stems from shifting the diagnosis to gender dysphoria.
Well, that's where I say, how can you prove that point? Lots of things were happening in this time frame.
Oh, it's not completely, it's just one of the factors, but it's an important factor.
From my perspective, I don't know how much more to say on this now. From my perspective, changing the diagnosis from transsexualism to gender dysphoria just made it possible to diagnose people who really have a mental disorder, but not of the level of calling it transsexualism. So it's like if you have a cold that's giving you sniffles, you have a cold, but you don't have pneumonia. Okay. So that's how I saw it. Now, while we're on the topic of, there's one funny thing about the DSM criteria for gender dysphoria that nobody points out, which is that it's silent on the matter of ROGD kids for the simple reason that the committee finished meeting and wrote its recommendation before there were ROGD kids. So so this committee was doing its thing in a certain historical time period. And you have to keep that in mind. Nobody yet, but somebody might attack the DSM and say, look, it's so incomplete, it doesn't have ROGD in it. Sure, because there wasn't ROGD. That phenomenon hadn't started yet by the time that committee had finished its work. So, again, I don't want to be seen as defending the work of a committee which did some things that mightily annoyed me, but ignored and annoyed me. But I think you have to be fair.
I think so too. You do, and I do think there's a lot we don't know, but we're getting to know more every day, and we're certainly putting things together. I think so long as we remain open-minded, I think we'll get further and further into what happened. I could talk to you all day about that move from transsexualism to gender identity disorder, and then to gender dysphoria. And I also think that the treatment is one day going to be considered something like lobotomies, that this is a sledgehammer to smash a nut, and there are better ways to handle things. But we can't, sadly, speak to you all day, but fabulous, fascinating conversation, Ray.
I have a couple things I want to add. One is, at one point you were starting to say some encouraging stuff about now we can have more research. No, you're not going to have decent research on gender identity disorders for another 10 or 20 years because it basically comes out of academia. Those are the people with the stat skills and the knowledge of how to do it, and it's a toxic topic. Even before I retired, I would have these bright-eyed students come in and they'd be so interested in gender identity disorders. And I'd say, you can research some other topic where patients will actually be grateful if you try to help them and you won't be getting attacked. This is not the wonderful research opportunity you might think it is. I have to be honest about that. I am not optimistic that there is going to be. There are some heroic individuals like Mike Bailey and his students who do continue to do research in this area, but the majority of universities, nobody's going to touch it because nobody wants a lot of trans activists phoning their deans or whatever and trying to get them fired. So it's going to be a while before there is any serious research with regard to descriptive pathology or maybe etiology. So I guess that was the one thing that one little downer that I felt I needed to add.
A pity, but it's true, sadly.
Yeah.
And, with regard to treatment, which I never really addressed, was like
No.
psychotherapy. First place, I don't know if any psychotherapy has ever cured autogynephilia. It might help an individual to manage it.
Manage it.
A patient who comes in and says, I'd really like to stifle this impulse because I love my wife, I love my children, I would like help in learning how to keep a lid on this so I don't I don't throw my life away for the sake of autogynephilia. And I think psychotherapy could possibly be helpful in cases like that.
And do you think if we need to stop celebrating these men coming out as women then, because that's encouraging them to blow up their lives. That's encouraging them to succumb, I suppose, to their paraphilia rather than seek the psychotherapy route.
Yes, I'm sure that the media valorization of transsexuals has helped make the idea of psychotherapy less appealing. But there's one more little dash of cold water reality that I have to throw out, which is that how are you going to compel a patient to go to psychotherapy who doesn't want to? You can cut off all sources of third-party payment, either by a provincial government like in Canada or via a third-party insurance payer, but you can't stop patients from going to Thailand or whatever or paying for their own surgeries. So when people like the online commentariat, they have fantasies of some kind of society in which, I don't know, clinicians or somebody has some ultimate authority to stop people from having sex reassignment surgery. You can't stop people because they'll go abroad and do it. So
They'll do it to themselves.
I agree. I was just reading about Tabletop Brown because I'm writing about the people who have their healthy legs amputated, and that guy, was chopping off legs in his garage.
I met him, actually.
Did you meet him?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, can you just tell me about him? Just that's where we'll end it.
Then we'll finish you. Thank you.
With Tabletop Brown.
All right. I was invited to a conference at Columbia University in New York, and it was a conference for these apotempnophiles, so people who were preoccupied with wanting to have healthy arms or legs amputated, usually legs. Yeah. For a while, it took me a while to figure out why was I invited to this anyway. I mean, I was happy to go there.
What year was this?
Oh, damn. I would have to look that up for you.
Approximately. What decade?
It had to be before 95 because I was still working at the gender clinic. So before 95. Let's say we're talking around 1990.
Okay.
Anyway, so I was thinking, well, why was I invited to this? I'm going to tell this long story, then I'm going to forget my main point. I've already forgotten my main point. Oh, no, regarding Robert Smith. Oh, yeah. So I was trying to figure out why was I invited to this conference? And I eventually became clear. They thought that because I was an expert in gender identity disorders, that I could help them somehow get apotemnophilia treated in a similar way to transsexualism, and that I could help them, like, how would we set up a protocol analogous to the real life test for transsexuals of making them live as the opposite sex before you approve surgery? How could this be applied somehow to apotemnophiles so that they could have some clinical legitimacy for going to a surgeon and having some kind of socially approved amputation. So that's why I was invited. They thought I would have some practical advice to offer because of my experience in gender identity disorders. And I said to them, I'm still not getting to my main point, but I said, well, there's a difference here in that, becoming the opposite sex, let's say becoming a woman, is not actually conferring a disability on the patient, but amputating a healthy leg would be conferring a disability on the patient. So the situation is quite different. Well, of course, they were all ready for that one, and they proceeded to regale me with stories of how differently abled people could manage just fine with only one leg. So they were ready for that.
But doesn't chopping a man's penis off make him disabled in a quite profound way?
Well, their answer would be, I want to become a woman. Is being a woman a disability?
But being a man without a penis is a disability.
But being a woman without a penis is not a disability.
But he's not a woman, he's a man.
Well, in their perception, they're women. So,
But you are weakening their body. Objectively,
Very much so.
you're weakening their body. But anyway, keep going.
Go.
anyway, so it was at this conference that I think his name was Robert Smith, was it not? You might
Originally in
remember.
Scotland.
And he was present there. And so I got to speak to him. I was a brief conversation. And I remember him saying that, and this was, I think he had already been prohibited by his hospital from doing any more of these amputations. But what sticks in my mind was that he said to me, "Oh, well, if I thought that a patient had had any history whatsoever of fetishistic arousal with the idea of being an amputee, then I wouldn't amputate on them." And I thought, like, that's exactly how people used to talk about sex reassignment surgery, that they had this idea that if patients have any history of sexual arousal with cross-dressing, they would be ineligible for sex reassignment surgery. That idea was dispensed with. I mean, that was, to use the cliche, more honored in the breach than in the observance. And here was this guy talking about doing amputations of arms and legs with the same kind of way that people used to talk about.
But I mean, I've read him saying that, and he's either stupidly naive or he's just outright lying. And I came to the conclusion he was outright lying because he agreed to cut off the leg of a man called Greg Firth, who co-wrote the paper that defined apotemnophilia with John Money. John Money and Greg Firth co-wrote that 1977 paper. Smith agreed to chop off Firth's leg. He was the third one set to have his leg chopped off when the hospital in Scotland shut him down. He only managed 2, and then they shut him down before Greg Firth. That man wrote the paper about apotemnophilia. He was open about it being an erotic desire, and Smith agreed to chop his leg off. So I think he was just outright lying.
Well, in my days in gender, I certainly knew a lot of physicians, including surgeons. And if you think they go off and study all the relevant psychiatric literature before they make a decision about operating, you're talking about very different surgeons than I knew.
Oh, so you don't think he knew Greg Firth's history of helping John Money define
because
it?
Greg Firth had a book that the surgeon would have read it.
And he wrote a book, Amputee Identity Disorder. Right. He tried to get it turned into Amputee Identity Disorder. What makes you think
the surgeon would have read the book? These guys, they come in the morning, they scrub in, they do their surgeries by 3 or whatever. It's a different life.
I should be clear, though, that Robert Smith is separate from Tabletop Brown. Tabletop Brown was that man who was chopping legs off in his garage. Greg Firth and a man went to Tijuana, where Tabletop Brown was operating out of a filthy hotel room. They both wanted the legs chopped off. His friend went first. This Tabletop Brown chopped off the man's leg in a filthy hotel room. The next day or the day after, the man died of gangrene. Greg Firth then left Mexico, went to Scotland, and got Robert Smith to agree to it instead.
Yeah, obviously I've been kind of, poking a little gentle fun at Robert Smith, and I'm not in favor. As I said to a room full of apotemnophiles, that I did not think that this was analogous to sex reassignment. So I'm not in favor of it, but I think it's quite plausible that the surgeon had not read Greg Firth's book.
Okay, I think it's almost exam writing about this right now, so I would say this. I think they're the same. They're pretty much the same, except chopping off a leg is far less destructive to your health. And when you amputate an apotemnophile's leg, he actually becomes the object of his own desire. He becomes an amputee. Whereas when you chop off an autogynephile's penis, he doesn't become a woman. He still is a man without a penis. And so to me, he's probably less likely to lead a happy, fulfilling life than the apotemnophile.
It's an empirical question. I mean, I realize it might be very at first place, I understand all the objections of many people to what's happening, and I wouldn't argue with them. But, it's just an empirical question. Are there any people who are perfectly happy that they made the decision to have vaginoplasty? Yeah, probably. I think I've seen some. They're inconvenient because, you never like to have your argument qualified by ifs, ands, and buts, and there are exceptions. Nobody wants this. It's messy, and it complicates discourse. But it's an empirical question whether people are happier after sex reassignment. Now, you could make the argument, and a few gender critical feminists do, I don't care whether you're happy or not. I don't think you should be doing it. And I that's an argument. There's no reason you can't say that. No reason you can't say, I don't care whether you're happier. I don't think you should be able to do it. Lightning's not going to strike you. But they mostly don't want to argue that way. They mostly want to reverse engineer the pathology itself so that it fits with the conclusion they want to reach. And I have to admit, I find that mildly annoying.
Yeah, I hear you, but just to put it different, and I know we really should say goodbye soon, but I can't not say this point. I'm not a gender critical feminist, but I do think interventions should be measured with as much as we can, with an evidence base, with logic, with supported by research, and moving towards healthy interventions. We should be moving towards healthy. And that should be the overarching kind of impulse of any intervention. And I was quoted because I said, I don't care if they're happy. Is it a good intervention? And I was misunderstood by that, because they were kind of, the people who were misunderstanding me said, oh, I think happiness does matter more than health. And I'm like, no. That's not what I mean. People can say they're happy. They can say they're happy with their wife when it's quite visibly obvious they hate their wife's guts. People say a lot of things. You can't really judge something except by the assessments. What's the rate of depression? What's the rate of psychiatric admissions into hospital? What's the rate of prison? What's the rate of suicide? What is this as an intervention objectively? Let's look at that. I don't care whether you're happy, because frankly, your ability to assess your happiness is just like mine, probably very fallible. So I'm not that interested in whether they think it was a good decision. I'm interested in the actual, the objective evaluations that we can put on a larger scale now, because there's more people who are medically transitioning. And I think we can quite, with satisfaction, come to the conclusion this is not a healthy or effective or successful intervention in the larger sense. And I don't care whether they think it was a good one. I'm looking at the objective details.
Okay.
I knew you were going to say something like that. Anyway, I felt very important to say there's a difference between whether they're happy or not and whether it's a good intervention.
I don't know what to say to it. I mean, like I said, I'm not gender dysphoric. If I were gender dysphoric, I would want to be happy, But I think we're in a zero-sum game situation right now, and everybody's not going to be happy. We're in a zero-sum situation in which either gender critical feminists are going to succeed in stopping sex reassignment altogether, or they're not going to achieve that 100%. But there's not going to be any compromise, and there's not going to be a situation where everybody ends up happy. It's going to be a situation where there are winners and losers. And that's how I see it.
Okay.
Wow, Ray, that was brilliant.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
That was
really,
amazing.
Really fascinating. Amazing.
Right.
Yeah.